This is a webinar on three different things which are interconnected. The blockchain, whatever that means, self-sovereign identity, whatever that means, and those of us who are in academia, I guess, have an idea of what credentials are all about. But I want to start with this. This was me at 5:58 this morning when I switched on my phone. I hadn't finished my slides and I thought it was pretty ironic, isn't it? Here's a cartoon saying, I recommend less screen time, except of course for our therapy sessions, school, work, staying connected with loved ones, dating, telehealth, yoga instruction, and searching for vaccine appointments. So welcome to yet another screen session. I'm sorry, but that's what we're in. I'm not here to sell you crypto. I don't own any crypto. I wish I'd bought stuff ages ago. A lot of people told me I should have. I didn't. That's my misfortune. What you're going to hear here are basically my worldview on the subjects. So again, this is a very personal take on things, and it is a mix of, I guess, my work over many years, doing different things, but which for me have one link, one chain, which is change. I've always been in the business of change all my life, all my working life, ever since I started working when I was 18. So what you will hear here are views which are informed by public policy, by my interest in connected learning, in people using technology to help each other. So I've always been very much into the whole idea of the peer. New media, which is what I teach. My interest in Industry 4.0 as to how the world of work is being repurposed and reformulated because of, despite new technologies and emerging technologies. And I found my way into the blockchain in education around about 2016, 2017. But specifically, again, in terms of the knowledge base I will be drawing on, there are a couple of things, and this is simply just so you can see where I'm coming from. I've written about the subject for the European Commission. I project managed, I guess it was the first nation state pilot which was using the blockchain for education credentials. I'm involved in a Horizon 2020 project. I'll talk to you about that. I'm involved in the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure project, which is a huge EU project. I'll talk to you about this. And I've done some work for the ILO and UNESCO, but you can vaguely see where I'm coming from, okay? I'm somebody who's been working since he was 18. I got into academia late in my life. I did a PhD for fun, and I guess I'm addicted to learning. Couple of things. The project I'm talking about, this Horizon 2020 project, is something driven by the 3CL Foundation. It's of interest to this project really because our point of departure was that let's look at how the blockchain will impact the future of education. And the idea was, at least when we won the project, was that this will also inform Horizon Europe when it comes to funding regimes. And our outputs really at the moment are surveys and roundtables. So if you search delforall.eu, you'll find some of this work that we're doing. I think what was of particular interest here is that the EU is at the moment involved in a huge project, and I'm very pleased that there's here in the audience Luis, who is the co-convener for the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure project when it comes to this thing called diplomas. Diplomas meaning credentials, but in terms of EBSI, the EU has to date invested about 400 million euros, about 300 different entities contributing. There's a whole team of people involved. There are about 20 member states hosting 27 live nodes, 3 new case studies being added to the 4 core case studies that till now have been looking at the blockchain and notarization, the blockchain and diplomas, the blockchain and this weird thing called self-sovereign identity, and the blockchain looking at trusted data sharing. Okay, but what we have to look at this project really within the context of building blocks. That EBSI is one of Europe's Connecting Europe Facility digital building blocks, where a building block is an open and reusable digital solution, and it can take the shape of, you know, a framework, a standard, a software, or a software as a service, or any combination of these things. I think the point I need to make here is that while, as George said, for many people the blockchain is just something like duh, or simply means I didn't buy any cryptocurrency and I wish I should have, the EU is looking at putting infrastructure to good public good. And in fact, if you had to look at the use case group that I'm part of, these are very communist things, aren't they? Give control back to citizens, build cross-border services, and spark the ecosystem adoption. Now, the challenge with talking about the blockchain is that within my audience here, there are people who are experts in the subject, and there are people who maybe have never heard of this. So I have to navigate this strange middle ground. Okay, so bear with me. If some of the stuff I'm going to share with you is like, duh, you know, just think of Billie Eilish, or if it's like, what is it? I think that's why we will record this, because some of the slides are text busy and you'll be able to look at them later. So the blockchain. The blockchain is a type of distributed ledger technology. The distributed ledger is a decentralized database distributed over several computers or nodes, managed by a whole bunch of people, different people. But here's the magic thing: without the participation of a central authority. So each node has equal status in terms of authority without a central authority or server managing a database. So every node can independently maintain and update the ledger, and any of the nodes will verify its existence. For me, the attraction of that was my love affair with the internet at the very beginning. Okay, decentralization doesn't belong to anyone, might be useful to someone, so have the internet somewhere in the back of your mind, the blockchain. But the blockchain is a record also of chronological transactions, pretty much like a financial ledger. I had started life as an accountant, debits and credits, okay? So transactions are recorded with an immutable cryptographic signature called a hash, and then grouped in blocks. If I want to add another layer of complexity here, is these transactions, which are happening on this ledger, okay? Every new set of transactions or blocks are actually recorded and then cryptographically linked to another record, to the previous record, forming something called a chain. So every new block includes a hash, we call it, of the previous one, chaining them together, hence a blockchain. The final thing maybe we should think about is that blockchains are the foundation of very high-profile technologies such as cryptocurrencies, like the Bitcoin. And the whole promise has been that of the blockchain, it's been the promise for quite a long time now. The promise is it will change the way data is managed, but also shared in a variety of industries, including, and that was the attraction for me in 2016 when I started putting things together, including education. Okay, so blockchains have introduced quite a bit of stuff here. Ledgers, transactions, things connected to each other, blocks, hashes. You know what? Should you care about all of this stuff? Well, if you are a technical guy, yes. If you're an ordinary citizen like me, it's technology. Let's look at a bit of the ledger stuff though here, okay? We're talking about transactions. When we say that the blockchain is a public decentralized ledger, so it's not something that your accountant holds, okay? It's something where there's a transaction number, which is time-stamped. There's a sender, person one, sending potentially an asset, you know, from A to B to person two. It could be a unit of currency, it could be a deed to a property, it could be a certificate. So person one, sending something to person two, okay? And then person one again, and the whole thing is basically registered. Okay, pretty much like the old scribes used to register stuff, except it's a public ledger which seemingly does not belong to anyone. So it doesn't seemingly belong to the accountant. The other thing we need to talk about is that the blockchain is a cryptographically secure, again, decentralized distributed database ledger. And what this means is that when the data is read or written from the database, the correct cryptographic keys are needed to complete a transaction. So I think in terms of two keys, a key to go into your home. Here there are two keys. One is a public key, and basically it's the address and the database where the information is stored. And then there's a private key. The private key belongs to the citizen, okay? Which is your personal key. It's the security which prevents other people from updating the information unless they have that correct key. And we're still talking about a digital log or a digital database of transactions, whatever they might be. Here's a pen. I'm giving the pen to George, and the ledger records the transaction. Alex gives the pen to George, and George now receives the pen, and the pen belongs to George. But it's a database, again, that is shared across a public or private network. This whole issue is also related to the integrity of the process of what's happened. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at things like this, these graphs, when there are transactions happening, metadata being generated, references to previous blocks, and that eventually there will be a block which is notarized. Just bear in mind that there's a transaction happening, and if we had to think in terms of a credential, I will talk a bit about this. Okay, it's the notarization of a credential on the blockchain means, what it means technically, it's storing this thing called the hash on the distributed ledger. I mean, I think at this stage, what is a hash? Think of terms of the word fox. The cryptographic hash function might be a whole bunch of numbers. If you go from fox and it becomes the red fox jumps over the blue dog, the cryptographic function seems to be a whole other bunch of numbers, okay? And that's registered. But if at some stage you start having mistakes in, and look, there's a mistake here, O-U-E-R instead of over, or it's misspelled over there, the input will not be validated. The input cannot be generated from the digest. I think all we need to think about right now is, yes, it's garbage in, garbage out, but there is a system in place that if something happens, which is strange, the system itself will not allow a transaction to be validated. Here's some eye candy really in terms of, you know, what does a ledger, this blessed ledger, remember? I think I need to explain this much, except there's, let's say there's a transaction, there's a sender, numbers, receiver, numbers, content, numbers. But what's actually happening here is, again, somebody sends something, somebody receives something, there's this token transfer. I'm not going to spend any time talking about the tokens right now. Okay. More numbers are generated. Maybe what's more interesting is this, is that what's happening on the blockchain are these strange transactions here. But in terms of our interface, which can be our mobile phone, other things are happening. In other words, already in this country, there are 16-year-olds who get alerted about a school leaving certificate. They have no idea that there's this strange thing called the blockchain happening. But they are told, you can now use your private key, go to this site, put in this number, and suddenly on their phone, they can download a PDF version of the certificate. What's interesting is that that certificate has been notarized on the blockchain. And I will tell you what that means as we go through this presentation. Okay. So again, key features, why this blessed blockchain, strange numbers, hashes, things like that. Okay. Think in terms of the concept of a modern database. The modern database normally means that a user stores his or her information and you trust someone to do it. I don't know, you trust Microsoft. You trust the institution maybe. Okay, you trust the university, and the institution then manages that central database. Okay, and then at some stage, these parties here go and consult the database. That looks okay, doesn't it? Well, what the blockchain does is it addresses the risks involved in having this thing, the central database, which might be a university based in Syria that just got bombed, for instance, or a university with a registrar who's not very responsive to people asking for information about certificates. Okay, so the blockchain addresses the risks by removing the need for a central authority, because each user who is a node stores a complete copy of that database on the machine, and each user node has to approve each entry happening, and the version with the most copies is the true version. If all this seems strange, I will keep on adding layers here, because one of the amazing things about the blockchain, and I mentioned about things disappearing, is its immutability. It's the fact that it is resilient, but it also guarantees that something which has happened is there, stored in posterity. And when we talk about records, and records can be any record, it can be a birth certificate, it can be a certificate to anything, it could be your Kung Fu certificate for all I know, but records are cryptographically linked, making them nearly impossible to change. So in other words, data in the blockchain cannot be altered or removed, and every transaction exists in perpetuity while the blockchain exists. And the database can only be updated when the majority of independent computers check and verify those credentials that allow you to write to the database. And there's always also this system of a security against a single point of failure, or somebody trying to do something weird to try and corrupt the database, because the database can only be updated when two things happen. When the correct credentials are being applied, that means there's both a public and a private key, or those credentials being verified also by the majority of the people in the network. So it's not just I'm giving a pen to George, okay? Other people who are in that public network through a system called the blockchain verify that that transaction actually happened. If I may, I think there's somebody who's not muted, and I'm getting a bit of feedback in my ears. If somebody could mute themselves, I'd be grateful. Okay, so we've gone from it's indestructible, technically, to it's very transparent. And it is particularly useful in environments where people don't trust other people. So think in terms of, I don't know, selling a property, for instance. The distributed electronic ledger functionality provides a mechanism for a community to record, but also to exchange information. And because every member maintains his or her own copy of the information, and all members must validate any updates collectively, okay? And this information could represent anything, as we said, transactions, contracts, assets, identities, practically anything else that can be described in a digital form. Every network user has their own copy, I repeat, of the entire blockchain. So entries and updates are permanent, they're transparent, they're searchable, and it makes it possible for anybody in this community, okay, to view the transactions histories in their entirety. So we've gone from it's indestructible, it's also very transparent. It's very transparent to see how a transaction happened. Think in terms of our health records now. Wouldn't it be nice if all our health records in Malta, for instance, where we have a combination of health records, maybe your GP, then your GP passed away, went somewhere else, so I don't know where those health records are. And then there are other health records which are in hospital, but we don't have all of these things in one single place. Wouldn't it be nice to have all our health records available to us at our fingertips, stored, and we can use them whenever we wanted to? The other thing about the blockchain is that it's some people, and this is where the philosophers get involved, and where people like me get excited, I guess. It's the idea of a decentralized democracy which is built on a trustless architecture. We have a database which is shared across a number of participants. We have this trustless network of participants where they don't need to know each other, but the computers are doing the work of trust, and where information is potentially available to all participants at a moment in time. Now think in terms of a university, which is so much dependent on a whole bunch of people for doing the things that we all hate to do, called administration. Think in terms of a system where the business of administration of a university could potentially be trusted to the blockchain, and universities could go back to doing what they were supposed to do, to the business of teaching and learning. And on the other side, this is where we get into this thing where people start getting very nervous, the idea of disintermediation, the mediator, the gatekeeper. This is about the death of the gatekeeper, okay? Because blockchain enable verification of peer-to-peer transactions without a centralized mediator. Interoperability is something which is a technical term. Think in terms of exchange of data, exchange of information from one entity to another within our world. Think in terms of exchange of information about a student who is now went, did a degree in Malta and is now in Korea. I met one of these guys who's now clubbing, which you can do in Korea, which you can't do in Malta, but needs to tell people in Korea that he's actually still in a university degree program in Malta, and having somebody else recognize that. Think in terms of interoperability as not needing the universities, if there are two entities, or an employer, to get involved in the process. Interoperability is normally deemed to be a technical process. Increasingly, it's a human process. So we've gone through the blockchain, whatever that means. And we're now going to talk about the blockchain and this very interesting concept called self-sovereign identity. Self-sovereignty, which implies power. Identity, which means us, no? I mean, you know me as Alex Grech. At least George told you I'm Alex Grech. But I mean, I was called Alex Grech by my parents. But until Alex Grech was registered in the, in whatever the notary's office is here, or the birth certificates, Alex Grech didn't exist. There's a very famous paper which was produced by Christopher Allen in 2016. I would ask you to search for it. It makes for fascinating reading. And Allen started talking about the path to self-sovereign identity. And at one stage he said, this is the next step beyond user-centric identity, where the user, us, me, I, must be central to the administration of identity. I'll give you a couple of crazy situations, right? Those of you who use social media right now, as I tell my students, am I who I am, or am I who Facebook thinks I am? Think in terms of a system where I can really control every single component of my identity, as opposed to Facebook controlling it, or as opposed to the government that gives me an ID card with my name and the number, and they say that's my identity. And Allen came up with these 10 principles of self-sovereign identity, which I'm going to go through very quickly, okay? He talks about the principle of existence, that users must have an independent existence. He talks about control, that users must be able to control their identities. Or access, users must be able to have access to their own data. I talked about health records, that would be useful for me. Transparency, that systems and algorithms being employed must be transparent. Or persistence, that identities must be there forever, must be long-lived. Or even, I'm thinking of education records here, portability, that the information and services about your identity must be transportable because we are increasingly global animals, or we used to be before the pandemic. And hence interoperability here within this context means that identities should be as widely used as possible. And also consent, that users must agree to the use of their identity. Minimization, disclosure of claims must be minimized, protection, rights of the users must be protected. So you look at that, and this thing got people very excited. And it just happened that people started to link the blockchain the affordances of the blockchain with what I was describing to you before, with these principles of self-sovereign identity. So think in terms of your traditional identity management system on one side, where the user's identity is defined from the perspective of the provider, whoever gives you that identity. In terms of a university, the university gives the student the status of being a student. Okay? That's the way it works in a traditional identity with a centralized database. So defined from the perspective of the provider for a specific purpose, and therefore only valid within the domain of that specific provider, within that purview. And that people have, again, how many identities do we have? All sorts of identities conferred to us, and passports, proof of employment, diplomas, and also by various third parties operating as a source of authority. Think in terms of the notary, the rubber stamp, okay? But you also have credentialing bodies, okay? In Malta we have the National, I don't know what it's called now, National Commission for Further and Higher Education or something like that. In terms of self-sovereign identity, it's very different. Here, individuals are the ultimate source of data about themselves. So a citizen's identity pre-exists before the conferral of an identity by any third party. And in building and governing a network of globally acceptable self-sovereign identity, in any such network, there must be three core tenets, okay? The individual controls, the individual is responsible for security, and there must be full portability. If these three things are not ticked, you do not have self-sovereign identity. Okay. So back to the blockchain, maybe, or maybe not. You know, in digital interactions, users are enabled to choose which specific pieces of their own information, claims, or credentials they can disclose to their third parties. And verifiable credentials are credentials such as education degrees, business licenses, or citizenship, which are issued by an authority or verifiable authority, and normally it's a signature of an attestation issuer, which can attest its validity. I did a PhD pretty late in my life, because in my previous life, my qualifications all said that I was in finance. I was a chartered accountant. I remember when I decided to apply for a PhD program, I had to wait like an idiot for about 2 weeks before somebody in London said, "Oh yeah, Alex Grech, yeah, it really is a chartered accountant." Okay, why did I need to do that and wait for 2 weeks when I had the certificate on my? Probably I'd lost the certificate, but do you see what I mean? Who did that certificate belong to? Me? Or the Chartered Association of Certified Accountants? When you receive a certificate from university, who does that certificate belong to? Does it belong to the university or the student who spent 3 years doing whatever they had to do so they could wear a funny hat? So self-sovereign identity really is about people having the rights to create, own and manage their identity records in a manner that is private, no dependency on a centralized authority, and this requires both recipient ownership, and some people will say, yeah, it's not just that, you should also not be dependent on, say, a Microsoft as a central database. Okay. Now, when a blockchain is deployed, okay, and it's properly used as a decentralized verification network, it offers the ability to unlock this power of digital records, making them trustworthy, instantly verifiable anywhere in the world. The trouble is that if you don't use the blockchain properly, it's just an unnecessary, cumbersome technical layer. I pause with this because this has been used as an excuse by many people in positions of power who know that the blockchain does all of this wonderful stuff to do absolutely nothing. The third layer I'm going to introduce, and this should be very easy to get through because we all have credentials. It's what we all slave to earn, whether you go and get a PhD or whether you get a certificate proving that you're a panel beater. But in terms of higher education, this is the typical process model for it. You know, there's input, education resources, There's the process, the business of teaching and learning, and there's the output, and that's the education credential. And by credential, we're talking about an accredited learning outcomes. So a set of knowledge, skills, and or competencies which we acquire and which are demonstrated by an individual after completing formal, informal, or non-formal learning process. Note the word learning. Okay? And this is what we don't even think about, do we? That's the credential, and it has been there forever. But if you look at the process of learning, flip it to the other side, well, there's different ways that we learn. No, there's the formal stuff that we who are employed by higher education institutions do. There's also informal learning. How do you do this? Increasingly, we all turn to online to learn stuff. Then there's non-formal learning, which is learning embedded in activities, which might not be deemed to be learning, but it might mean, I don't know, your son going to do a rock climbing course, for all I know, okay? Or working, teaching English to refugees, which is what my son actually did do about 2 years ago. So different forms of learning. And also, learning is becoming quite sexy in a way, because now as we start to break down the silos of how we learn, people are also saying, hang on a second, if I've just sat here and listened to Alex Grech waffle away for an hour, can I prove that I listened to this guy, I learned something? Is there a certificate which is going to be given? Or can I get a badge for this? Or is this rock climbing thing that I had? I mean, so we're going from credentials to very smaller credentials, smaller modules of learning than those covered in our conventional academic awards. And increasingly, with the affordances of technology, of all things digital, these are becoming part of a digital credentialing ecosystem. Now, why are these important? Well, if you're going to go for a job, I guess, and it's head-to-head between somebody who's got a degree in communications and a degree in communications, but there's somebody who has also acquired some of these certificates by doing something out of his or her comfort zone, will that count for something? But does this certificate have any value, which might be in paper format? Or rather, what if this person, the recipient, had the means to be able to collect all of these different types of credentials acquired through his or her life, and then decide which of those to share with whom at a particular moment in time? So we're also now going from this idea of accredited qualifications, and I'm not going to spend much time about this, we all know what these are. Non-accredited qualifications, records of experience, and what that credential might have, you could think of it in many different layers, okay? There's also the identity of the awarding body, what skills were acquired. If we were to look at the blockchain, think of how many different layers we could incorporate in a system. And then it's up to the recipient to decide as and when to share those records with whoever they want to share them with. So if you had to look at the traditional building blocks of credentials, I'm not going to spend any time on this, just think in terms of processes. Normally you have to identify who the individual is who's going to be awarded a certificate. There's something about issuance, that this credential is going to be issued. Sometimes it's going to be revoked. Sometimes it's time barred. If I don't pay my subscription to ACCA, they will, and I haven't this year yet, they will say you're no longer a member of something. So it also needs to be stored, this certificate, somewhere. The sharing, well, the blockchain ecosystem dictates that it's the citizen who decides who to share that certificate with. If we are incorporating self-sovereign identity as part of the DNA, I guess. And we also need to verify stuff, okay? Now, the risks with things as we are doing things right now, there are many. One, your data can be changed, can be hacked, okay? People can change grades, believe it or not. There are databases that can be compromised. There are loads of fake universities around the world. Data can be deleted. You can have data loss. If you think that's a joke, think in terms of refugees who turned up in Malta claiming that they're doctors, but they had nothing to prove that they were actually doctors. The institution can also prevent access. These students don't given access to metrics held about them. Why did I fail? Why didn't I fail? How did I, disputes about ownership. The institution can put conditions on access. I'm going to charge you money. You want your certificate again? 20 euros. You can't afford it? Tough. But the institution can also use data in an unauthorized manner. There's a sharing of data with third parties without my permission. It can also start to profile students in ways that we all know what's happening with the Facebooks and Cambridge Analyticas of this world right now. So this idea of limited access to the underlying information, most credentials are not digital, lack of technical standards, closed standards for security, no aggregation. We, ironically, have a fine mess when looking at the humble piece of paper that my father decided to hang on his wall. So if we're going from the credential, that's what it used to be. Now the affordances of the blockchain are such that we're starting to talk about verifiable credentials. And these are statements given to individuals by issuers that assert something about the individual. It's the individual, the recipient, who keeps the credentials in a digital wallet for use when verifiers need to prove the individual's claims, but note that the claim is being made by the recipient. Of course, there are governance authorities that can add contexts and rules to these transactions, such as deciding which issuers to trust. And the verifiable credentials also support a variety of proof mechanisms to ensure that credentials are reliable, that the issuer who issued the credential does attest that they are correct, or that something has been suspended, or that something has been revoked. So, final layers. We discussed verifiable credentials. Technically, what happens is, and I'm not sure I should spend any time of this because time is moving on, but there's an ecosystem around verifiable credentials, digital identifiers, the use of private keys, and the use of public keys, where we can use the blockchain to do all of this stuff for us, and in the process really empower people who should be at the core of the higher education system, the learners. This, in fact, is a screen grab from the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure project, which is this ongoing project. And you can see, we're saying EBSI identity and diploma management. It's about creating an entire ecosystem. And you can see that what's involved here are issues related to identity, request and issue identity credential, store evidences of issuance of identity credential, present your identity credential, and also what's happening at the front end. Okay, there are things happening in the background. The front end must be, the diploma, there's somebody requesting and issuing a diploma credential, the storage of evidence of what that credential means. It gets presented, it gets checked. Most people will only look at this thing, their wallet, what's on the phone, okay? Which will be the authentication and storage of credentials. Ironically, EBSI is dealing with all of these things, but it wants to make sure that when it comes to the last mile, they call it in telecoms, the interface, the wallet, that's going to be pretty much like an open kind of system, and people will use whatever wallets they want to use to store the credentials and then decide who and whom to share them with. While in practice, okay, there's a lot of this stuff which is happening in the background. People asking about, okay, fine, so now we're using the blockchain, but how do recipient keys or these decentralized identifiers get generated? How do they get retrieved? How do they get built into a credential? What happens if a vendor goes down or goes out of business? Can you still record these data? Does the issuing system allow records to be verified even if the issuing institution ceases to exist? And does your system allow you to anchor records on any blockchain? And then there's a very contentious issue here. Does your system use an open standard? What you're looking at here is essentially technical stuff, but it's the kind of stuff that people who are involved in projects, and normally they would be CIOs, maybe, They are looking at things like this. Technical people, the irony is that none of this stuff when it comes to decision making is really going to be decided by a technical person. Most of the time, these things get decided on the basis of clear communication, and many a times the decision is being made by a policymaker. It might be the rector of a university, it might be somebody within a ministry, it might be somebody in a school. What I'm going to go on now in the second bit of this presentation is I'm going to just give you some of the observations. The very personal observations, they might irritate some people, and 4 suggestions, which might be like, duh. But they are based on what I've been navigating, I guess, since 2016 and 2017, 2018. I was managing this big project to try and get the blockchain incorporated in Malta within a pilot study, I guess. So I will start with maybe the most contentious or the most personal to those of us who are in the business of higher education. And my view is that we're getting to a stage where the education model is almost broken. And you just have to look at that picture first to have an idea of where I'm going from. But increasingly, higher education has been grappling with this idea of a one-size-fits-all, and which is very disconnected from the need for personalized learning. Those of us who teach students know that not everybody learns at the same pace, and yet that's what we can give them. Okay, so one size fits all, disconnected from personalized learning. This used to be the problem that we all used to face, no? Students, laptops, shields, in the moment, not in the moment, connected with us. Are they really listening to us? Broadcast models, is that the way people learn or not? This has changed the whole equation. So these are various screen grabs of the early stages when in Britain, for instance, there were people who had gone actually on the campus and got locked up, and they started actually people saying, send drink, I'm COVID positive, you know. £9,250 spent for rent and I'm locked up. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that COVID-19 and the mass lockdown of young people is really starting to expose the fragility of the higher education bricks and mortar model. Okay, now in places like Malta we might not need to worry about it because of what the hell is the state, we just have one university. You know, the United States, there are many universities right now looking at the real estate and wondering what to do with it. What if the students don't come back? And again, there are many other issues that some of us grapple with. You know, the idea of elite colleges telling low-income students that they do not belong. What kind of education system do I want to have? I think anybody who has a child with one of these digital natives, I do have one. How do kids learn these days? Are they learning from the broadcast mode of education that we are all into? Or do they go and learn via YouTube? Or do they validate the learning via this kind of stuff? Are they using MOOCs to get extra information? And by the way, these are reputable organizations. And are they looking at their credentials and thinking, when I go and get a job, how am I going to use those credentials on LinkedIn? And what about this whole idea about connected learning, where you've got networks of educators and experts and youth-serving NGOs all mobilizing now, all using new technologies in the service of equity, of access and opportunity for all young people. This was really what I had in mind when we set up the 3CL Foundation, this idea of using connected learning. And the idea that somebody in some particular part of the world is prepared to use online to teach something to somebody else who needs it, and why don't we film it, even if we have to film somebody in a field, that might be of use to somebody. And I think the Commission as well in 2020, as the pandemic was starting to happen, they start, you know, things started to, there were many aha moments, I think. You know, the fact that 60% of educators had not used distance and online learning before the crisis. I distinctly remember the day, I think I've got it in my diary, when I was in George's office there, and we went from, this thing is really happening, what do? Do we go home? And we went home, we didn't come back. Now, luckily enough, some of us had some idea of how to navigate these things, okay? But many educators had no idea what to do. And these surveys that the EU is doing, 95% of educators believe COVID-19 marks a point of no return for how technology is being used in education and training. And this idea that online learning resources and content, however, need to be more relevant, interactive and easy to use. Just because we are using PowerPoint in broadcast mode like I am right now, and using Zoom like I am right now, is this good education? You know. Now, of course, what's happened is there have been some great things. I mean, our university did an amazing job of literally, doing its best to get, the Luddites, I guess, the people who were resisting, the teachers, educators, colleagues, resisting, teaching online. And as a result, educators have improved their digital skills, and many people want to do more with the technology that they have. But my second point is this. We've talked about the promise of the blockchain, the promise of self-sovereign identity, the promise of the credential being owned by the recipient. The thing is, has the blockchain really had a significant impact on education? This is an old slide from 2018, and I can bore you to tears with reports on how the blockchain can help with credentials and badges and records. The ones in yellow are the low-hanging fruit, but also in terms of security of buildings, public assistance, storing stuff on the cloud instead, and energy management. All of this stuff was meant to happen. Even my university set up a center for distributed ledger technologies, and yet that center is grappling with what? Can I hire somebody to administer some components of what that center is supposed to be doing? Okay, is education at the forefront of the so-called blockchain revolution? Does the blockchain really matter in 2021 when we have bigger things to look at? I mentioned the Dell for All project that we're running, and we started asking people questions. By the way, what was also changing with this Dell for All project is we started this project on the 1st of January 2020. We had one meeting in Luxembourg. The EU panicked and basically said, don't just look at the impact of blockchain, by the way, on the future education. Can you start looking at AI and augmented reality and virtual reality and gaming, anything which helps? And we started this whole wave of surveys with experts and educators. And what we're starting to come back is that most people are saying, which emerging technologies can you do something better with these learning platforms that we have, and conference tools, and maybe with analytics. When it came to emerging tech, people know something is happening with artificial intelligence. The blockchain was not really featuring. But we started saying, what permanent post-pandemic changes will there be to education? Notice here, more focus on trust and privacy of digital learning. Does that shout blockchain to you? More interdisciplinary collaboration, development of digital education skills. Education will be more digitalized in the future. There will be more blended learning. And I think, educators know best, don't they? And if you look across the pond, I had taken this from my friend Brian Alexander's blog post late last year. The US higher education sector, which is much more driven than most of Europe, but it's in similar crisis mode. They're struggling with things like student debt. When it came to education and technology, again, look, the LMS is, we need more MOOCs. Note where the blockchain is. Well, there's probably something happening in automation of education. There is going to be blockchain in education. There's campus digital threats we will close down. What about crowdfunding? There is a mess out there. There is a bloodbath out there. And I think the question we need to ask is twofold. Can this new blockchain technology help us address some of these problems that we have now? And also a hunch. Normally when things go quiet, and I'm old enough to remember the internet bubble in around about 2000. And when the internet bubble happened and everything crashed and everybody said this is the end of this whole thing in digital, it was during that time that a lot of work started to happen on what we now know as social media. Those of us who are scanning what's happening on a global level in terms of blockchain and education, we're starting to see a lot of interesting little things happening, which indicate that when things are quiet, this thing called the blockchain, which maybe we shouldn't even think about. It might be just the engine in my car and I just want to drive my car somewhere else. Interesting things happening. But if you want to get something done, decentralization, does everybody want decentralization? Really? Would a ministry be in favor of decentralization? Would a rector of a university be keen on decentralization? Decentralization is often perceived to be a threat to governance. So if we said that here's the trustless technology, no need for a central authority, every node holding a copy of the database. As soon as you start talking decentralization, you go into the whole political, I mean political, not necessarily the big P political, but power. The whole logical thing, is this a good idea? Do I really want all students to really own the records? We do, okay? Or the whole architectural thing, how much does it cost for us to do this blockchain lark? Come again? And resistance can come in many ways, okay? Little trust in trustless technology. People start telling you about levels of security and privacy and scalability. I distinctly remember conversations with, in my country, something called the MITA, the technology authority, saying, you want to use the public Bitcoin as the technology? You can't. And we said, we will. And why are you doing that? Because it's good for the students, okay? But I was in a position at the time that I could press those buttons. But most people say level of security, privacy, scalability, cybersecurity, sensitivity, insufficient levels for data and processes. It's a young technology. Don't deploy it. We will wait. We'll wait 20 years. You know, trust minimizing architectures should not replace, however, interpersonal trust. Open standards. Some people said, well, we're not ready for open standards. And by the way, a lot of the blockchain success stories being mooted. The Estonian one comes to mind. There's nothing really decentralized about the Estonian blockchain model, because also we haven't talked about, you know, you can have open blockchain, but they also have closed blockchains. Resistance will come in many forms. I think the fourth point I want to make is this magic word called interoperability. The exchange of information, the idea also that maybe a student might have a certificate and conceptually that certificate is interoperable enough that if he moves from Malta to China or to the States, it's automatically recognized. That's not really a technology issue. And what my colleague Louise and I did together with another colleague from Finland, we've just published a paper with the same topic of subject of this talk. And we had started drilling into this whole thing that interoperability has both a philosophical dimension and a technological dimension. And we've talked about the technical dimensions, which are the verifiable credentials. But you then start getting into the whole legality aspects of it all. The idea of identity and data. And what about GDPR? And isn't the blockchain against any notion of the GDPR? And how about EIDs? I mean, the EU is quite good at being seen to be doing the right thing, but then getting itself in a bit of a mess with other things, for instance, something which we've experienced and we continue to experience with the EBSI project. The whole thing about the semantic dimension, standardization models. And I think when it comes to the whole governance dimension, it's not just responsibilities related to technical governance, but also education governance. Decisions on the type of blockchain we need to deploy. We haven't talked about things like smart contracts either here, for instance, okay? And the accreditation taxonomies. Now, if all of this looks like I think I give up. Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? On one side, you have the EU investing 400 million euros in building a technology infrastructure for the public good. But on the other side, will member states say, I think there's something good in this because it's for the good of our citizens? I think this came off McKinsey have just published right now, in terms of the greatest challenges to any technology transformation. When you start looking at these things, skills gaps, cultural differences, changes in culture, difficult to find the right kind of people. You don't just need technical people if you want to do transformation. You need the business process people. You need to have the evangelists. You need to have people who are prepared to put their neck on the line, like I had to in 2017, when the minister basically told me, this thing called the blockchain, I vaguely get it. But is it for the good of students? And you're telling me it is. And then he said, it's on your head if you want to do this. So eat your own dog food almost. Run with this. Get this done. This is a slide I've shared in many parts of the world when people ask me, how do you get a project done in a country, even if it's a bounded community for 450,000 people? And I had literally listed all the people that I knew we had something to do with as we were starting to do this blockchain thing. So we're talking about, I don't know, who are the stakeholders? We started talking to the ministries and the policy makers, and then we found a technology partner. And then there were the communications people who wanted to go and celebrate what we were doing. Those of you may remember that we used to be called the blockchain island in those days. Okay, there were committees that wanted to know about these things. The Data Protection Commission had a lot of problems with GDPR, and we said, can you close an eye for the time being? Because the EU is trying to get this sorted. And at one stage, the Office of the Prime Minister got involved, and the finance people wanted to know how much money it's going to cost. And then we went to the actual institutions themselves. The people who, there were registrars saying, are you making my life better or worse? Do I have to do more work to get this bloody thing done? Okay. One thing you need to remember, if you're going to undertake a change program which has anything to do with the blockchain, you are always dependent on human networks, and these can never be automated. So a lot of it has to do with communication skills, being empowered. So again, and I'm getting to the final stage of this thing. We're straying past the 1 hour limit, I'm afraid. I'm going to do my best. Okay. Here are 4 suggestions of what we could potentially do if you really want to get involved in this whole blockchain lark. I think the first thing we should do is we should focus on disconnects, things which are not working, to determine where the blockchain may actually add value to this thing called education. And I think there are these 3 immediate applications for the blockchain. I will continue to strongly believe, that the credential belongs to the recipient, not the issuing body. And I think and you will be amazed that something as simple as the credential is never going to go away. That's what we all slave to do, to prove to somebody else that we've acquired skills. So the idea of automatically verifiable secure credentials, there's a lot of mileage in that. And you can build layers on that, on reputation systems, which can also be validated. And we also started to look at directories of trusted issuers. The EBSI project I'm involved with, for instance, there's a lot of work happening as to who can issue a credential and how can you make sure that that issuer is bona fide. I think in terms of Dell for All, as we started scaling up, though, what are these challenges? Can the blockchain help any of these? Okay, incompatible teaching materials, the need for more open education resources, need for capacity building. Okay, that's a bit of the acid test there. And recently, I think we had our first year audit. Professor John Demang from Open University shared this, and he said, I think this is where we can see on the basis of our research what the EdTech for the near future is going to be. We're going to have to make online video conferencing better. Pedagogically at the moment it's questionable. We should look at the concept of anywhere labs, not even on campus, looking at Internet of Things and augmented reality maybe. We should be looking at AI learning assistants. I would love to have one of those. This one, distributed ledgers for trusted student data. That goes back to where I started, I guess. This was an article which appeared from the US Department of Education in February 2020. I know the person who wrote it. And what Sharon had written, she said, education have a problem, put a blockchain on it. And then somewhere along the line she said, will blockchains fix everything? Maybe we want to propose a better question. How might blockchain support the educational ecosystem to increase access, provide opportunity, and promote success for all students? 4 days ago on LinkedIn, I decided I might as well tell people I'm going to do this lecture, right? So I just put a link to this lecture, to this webinar, and I said I'm going to be doing something about blockchain and credentials. Somebody, I have no idea who he was, but first he sent me a link, said this: here's a white paper that will help your upcoming discussion. My team and I have already built the blockchain platforms you're going to be discussing. I'll send our white paper and other information if you're interested. This is coming from something called the Scholar Coin white paper. Here's an illustration of what an education ecosystem might be, where you've got student safe wallets and various other things happening, and families and guardians all interconnecting in a system which it seems is being driven by the blockchain. I think what we have to remember is the blockchain was conceived as machines working together to reach agreement or consensus. I think it's an appropriate metaphor for collaborative networks, closer to my area maybe. And by building upon the scaffolding of existing trust and relationships, blockchains can spur thinking about data use, about data ownership, but also who controls that data. One of the things we're looking at is sort of slogan, not just for our Dare for All project, but maybe how can use the blockchain for education. Maybe we should think of a decentralized, resilient model for the education system we need. And I would say after the pandemic has been done. Second thing, if you want to do something, consider doing something called a pilot. Use pilots, use sandboxes to overcome your resistance to change. That's what we had done in Malta way back. And at one stage, I ran a conference in 2019, I think. Okay, the government of the Bahamas literally sent a whole delegation here to see what we were doing. And they ended up doing what Malta had done much better, because they went from education records to health records and other kinds of records. Again, normally it's the small entities, the crazies, who do these kind of things. So I think in terms of innovation, there aren't going to be too many, Maltas and Bahamases, or maybe there are, we don't know about them. But going back to the EBSI project here, we're at this stage right now. This is the EU. This is about creating an ecosystem. By joining it, each actor will be able to contribute to the future of digital Europe, which is another agenda, right? So here you have, some of the early countries that are doing early pilots with EBSI. And the whole idea is, what are you going to be doing? And my suggestion is, if you want to do some of these projects, you need to have a carrot and stick approach for adoption. You need to have some sort of regulatory frameworks. The technical standardization has to be right. We need to establish a clear common legal base for the deployment of smart contracts and digital signatures. We haven't talked about that, with appropriate coordination and convergence. We need to strengthen cooperation and exchange with international partners. Having something and this is why I use the Malta example. It worked in Malta, it works in the Bahamas, it works in Amsterdam, it works in a little of Frankfurt. Maybe we should look into this. This is how people get encouraged. The EU is now promoting this whole concept of digital education hubs that identify, share, and scale up good practice, supporting the education and training sector with tools, frameworks, guidance, technical expertise, and research. I have to put the brakes on here. At the moment, the EBSI project is being led by DG Connect. DG Education and Culture are still not really part of the equation. At some stage, the two have to come together. We need to link national and regional digital education initiatives and actors. And we need to find some way of really supporting cross-sector collaboration and new models for exchanging of digital learning content. And primarily this thing called quality assurance. Again, with EBSI, what can make or break these things are quality assurance agencies that say, well, Nice of you to have run this thing, but we'll keep on using paper. We don't care, for instance. At the same time, there's many of these sites coming up trying to help people know that there are other projects happening. Here's something called positiveblockchain.io. If you have any idea of any good projects, you can go and plonk them there simply to encourage others. And I would suggest that we should look at the whole concept of verifiable learning credentials to break down its institutional ideological silos. I mean, my view is that verifiable, tamper-proof credentials for learning are really going to become invaluable in the post-pandemic education landscape. And I think we should look at the labour market. And the labour market is demanding new types of learning, and the labour market also has requirements, new requirements for credential solutions, but with the same validity as formal education credentials. They're looking at stackable credentials, they're looking at work-based experiences. They're also interested in fraud. This is something my colleagues at university were not like. You know, when we had the idea of setting up a pilot or pilots in Malta, and it was all going to be funded by government, would not have cost the University of Malta 1 cent. Okay, and we turned around the table, and it was very simple. The Malta College for Art Sciences and Technologies, you want to join? Join. The Institute for Tourism Studies, you want to join? Yes. The National Commission for Further Higher Education, want to do something with refugees? Join. Came to university, was like, we don't know. Okay, you're not doing it. That was 2017. I have tried. The head for the Center for Distributed Ledger Technologies has tried. Many other people have tried at the moment to get the University of Malta, the most important entity, to issue certificates and notarize them on the blockchain for free. Hasn't happened yet. So my view is that TVET organizations, lifelong learning organizations, and the labor market at the moment are more receptive to embracing self-sovereign identity and blockchain credentials than universities are. Fourth thing is, I think it's time to pull away from this technological determinism. And here I'm going to say something which maybe you might not expect. We need to understand a bit more what's happening with technology out there and how it's controlling our world. This is a slide I normally share with my students. You may say it has nothing to do with the technology, with blockchain, but I do put a blockchain up here. We know that technology is changing, we know our social world is changing, and we know all about these reflexive relationships. We have to look at blockchain within this context of other things changing and other priorities maybe. Will the blockchain help us have a better social world? Will it help us with some of the challenges that we have here? I think it's something we should look at. And maybe it can explain why things have been slower than expected. And I would suggest that having some foundational knowledge and basic digital literacies, like how can we focus on things right now? That's a real issue. With us just navigating our life through screens. We all have attention problems. How do we participate in something? How can we collaborate together on projects? How can we critically consume information, whether it's about the blockchain or whether this country is a mafia state, for instance, okay? And having an understanding of how networks work from the most micro to the most macro, I think would help us. Digital disruption can be found in the most mundane of applications, okay? I'm going to finish with this. I wrote a blog post in 2018, 19, I can't remember. But I had written, never underestimate the resilience of the credential as long as humans are in the business of demonstrating their worth to others. It remains the lingua franca of social capital. It will probably become even more important as young people get used to reinventing themselves every 5 years as informal and professional learning starts to secure parity with traditional higher education. And yet, we do need to reimagine the credential in view of the affordances of blockchain technologies. And that was my certificate on my father's wall, by the way. I think the blockchain promises decentralization, immutability, interoperability, and self-sovereignty and trust in the same solution. And yet, the blockchain is still a hammer looking for a nail. I don't know if education is that nail. I think the important question is whether the system, it's not whether the system is decentralized or it's centralized. I think it's whether the blockchain can truly contribute to an immediate future where monopoly is impossible. I think the alternative, especially in these days, is not necessarily inferior. The alternative is increasingly likely to become mainstream once COVID-19 is a memory. Okay, so thank you for your patience. Okay, that was my last slide. And I can take a breather. So thank you for bearing with me.